The studio lights were nuclear hot that night, and Toby Keith sat across from a host whose smirk had already written the narrative before a single word left his mouth. This wasn't an interview. This was an execution dressed up as conversation, and everyone in that room knew it. The host leaned forward, papers shuffled with theatrical precision, and the question came loaded with venom disguised as concern. Mr. Keith, critics have called you a warmonger, a propagandist who profits off American bloodshed. How do you respond to those who say your music glorifies violence and manipulates young men into dying for oil? The audience went silent. Camera operators stopped adjusting their angles. Even the producer in the control room held his breath. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the trap laid out in prime time. The chance to watch a country star from Oklahoma stumble over his own supposed jingoism and reveal himself as nothing more than a cash-hungry opportunist wrapped in a flag. But Toby didn't flinch. He didn't lean back defensively or reach for the glass of water producers always place just out of comfortable reach. He looked directly at the host, and something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not indignation, something deeper. Something that suggested this man had been preparing for this exact confrontation his entire life, without even knowing it. "You ever stood at Arlington?" Toby asked, his voice low and even. The host blinked, thrown off rhythm. This wasn't the script. "You ever walked those rows where 18-year-olds are buried under white crosses that go on for miles? You ever looked a Gold Star mother in the eyes and seen what it costs her to wake up every single morning, knowing her son ain't coming through that door again?" The studio stayed silent, but the silence had changed textures. It wasn't anticipation anymore. It was realization creeping in like cold air under a door. "I write songs about freedom because freedom ain't free, and pretending it is disrespects every person who paid the bill. You want to call me a warmonger? Fine, but you better understand something first. I didn't send those kids to war. I didn't make the policies. I didn't pull the triggers that killed them. What I did was make sure that when they came home in boxes draped in stars and stripes, somebody was singing their names. Somebody was remembering they existed. Somebody was telling their families that their sacrifice meant something. You think that's propaganda? Then you don't understand the first thing about what it means to love this country." The host tried to recover, stammering something about nuance and complexity, but the ground had already shifted beneath him. Toby wasn't done. "You sit here in your air-conditioned studio with your makeup artist and your teleprompter, and you want to lecture me about war. You want to talk about manipulation. Let me tell you what manipulation looks like. Manipulation is forgetting that somebody stood on a wall in Fallujah so you could have the freedom to sit here and call them a pawn. Manipulation is acting like patriotism is some kind of disease that needs to be cured instead of the one thing that binds 330 million people together when everything else is trying to rip us apart." The thing about Toby Keith that his critics never understood, and that night in that studio made brutally clear, was that he didn't argue from ideology. He argued from experience. He argued from the hundreds of USO tours he'd done, flying into combat zones when celebrities with 10 times his fame wouldn't get within 1,000 miles of danger. He argued from the hospital rooms where he'd sat with soldiers who'd lost limbs, lost friends, lost pieces of themselves they'd never get back. He argued from the funerals where he'd watched mothers collapse onto caskets and fathers stand rigid with grief, so overwhelming it turned them into statues. This wasn't theory for him. This wasn't a debate club exercise. This was his life. The host made one more attempt, reading from his notes about how Keith's song, courtesy of the Red, White and Blue, had been criticized for being overly aggressive, for promoting a culture of revenge, for reducing complex geopolitical situations to bumper sticker slogans. Toby let him finish, let him lay out the whole case, let him think he was building to something. Then he spoke again, and his voice had dropped even lower, more intimate, like he was talking to one person instead of millions watching at home. "My father was a soldier. He taught me that loving your country doesn't mean you think it's perfect. It means you think it's worth fighting for even when it's broken. When those towers came down, when 3,000 people went to work one Tuesday morning and never came home, something broke in all of us. We were scared. We were angry. We wanted to hit back. And yeah, I wrote a song about that. I wrote a song that said, we're not going to sit here and pretend this didn't happen. We're not going to act like we're above feeling rage when our people get murdered. Does that make me a warmonger, or does that make me honest? The studio audience, which had come in expecting to watch a takedown, started shifting in their seats. Some were nodding, others looked uncomfortable, confronted with a perspective they hadn't prepared themselves to hear. The host was losing control of his own show, and he knew it. He tried to interrupt, to steer back toward the talking points, but Toby raised one hand, not aggressive, just firm. No, you asked the question. Let me finish answering it. I've been to Walter Reed more times than I can count. I've met kids, and I mean kids 19, 20 years old, learning how to walk again on prosthetic legs, learning how to hold a fork with a hand that's made of metal and circuits. You know what they say to me? They don't complain, they don't whine about being manipulated or lied to. They say they're proud. They say they'd do it again. They say they're grateful to be alive, and they want to get back to their units. Now maybe you think they're brainwashed. Maybe you think they're too young to understand what really happened to them. But I think they understand something you don't. I think they understand that some things are bigger than yourself. Some things matter more than comfort or safety, or living a long, easy life. And pretending otherwise, sitting here in your comfortable chair pretending that everyone who believes in this country is just some rube who got conned, that's the real insult. The psychological architecture of what Toby was doing in that moment was masterful. Whether he planned it or not, he wasn't defending himself. He was forcing the host, forcing the audience, forcing everyone watching at home to confront the actual human beings behind the abstractions they were so comfortable debating. It's easy to talk about war as policy failure when the dead are just statistics. It's easy to critique military culture when soldiers are just concepts. But when you name them, when you describe their faces and their families and their sacrifices, when you make them real again, the entire conversation changes. The host couldn't dismiss grieving mothers. He couldn't mock amputees. He couldn't reduce crying children at funerals to collateral damage in his ideological crusade. Toby had taken the ground out from under him without raising his voice, without losing his composure, without giving anyone a soundbite they could clip and twist. You want to know what freedom means? Toby continued, and now there was something almost gentle in his voice, like he was explaining something to a child who'd asked an honest question. Freedom means you get to sit here and call me a warmonger, and I don't get to throw you in jail for it. Freedom means you get to write your op-eds and publish your think pieces and organize your protests, and nobody disappears you in the middle of the night. Freedom means we can disagree loudly, publicly, and at the end of the day we both go home safe. That's what those soldiers died for. Not for oil, not for corporations, not for politicians, for that, for the right to argue about what this country should be. And I'll be damned if I'm going to apologize for honoring that. The host had nothing. He tried to pivot to commercial break, tried to regain some semblance of control, but the damage was done. Not damage to Toby. Damage to the narrative. The story was supposed to be simple. Dumb country singer waves flag to sell records. But Toby had revealed something more complicated. Something the host's entire worldview wasn't equipped to handle. Here was a man who'd seen wars cost up close, who'd held the hands of the broken and attended the funerals of the dead, and who still believed in the thing he was being mocked for defending. That wasn't ignorance. That was conviction born from witness. And conviction like that doesn't break under smug questioning. When the show aired, the backlash wasn't what the producers expected. They thought they'd get clips of Toby looking defensive, stammering, retreating from his positions. Instead, they got a 3-minute monologue that went viral for entirely different reasons. Veterans groups shared it. Gold Star families thanked him publicly. People who'd never listened to country music started buying his albums because they wanted to support someone who'd stood firm under pressure. The host, meanwhile, got dragged across social media for weeks. Critics called him out of touch, performatively progressive, someone who cared more about seeming enlightened than understanding the actual lives of military families. But the real legacy of that night wasn't in ratings or record sales. It was in the conversations that happened afterward, in living rooms and bar rooms across the country. People who dismissed Toby Keith as some kind of cartoon patriot had to reckon with the fact that he knew more about war's cost than they did. He'd seen it, he'd lived in it, and his response wasn't to become cynical or bitter or to retreat into irony. His response was to honor the people who paid the price, to make sure their stories didn't get lost in political noise, to insist that their sacrifices meant something even when everything else felt meaningless. The thing about patriotism in America, the thing Toby understood and his critics often missed, is that it's never been about blind obedience or mindless flag-waving. It's about belonging. It's about believing that despite everything broken and corrupt and unjust about this country, despite all the ways it fails to live up to its promises, there's still something worth preserving. There's still an idea at the core, an idea that says people should be free to determine their own destinies, that no one is born better than anyone else, that you can disagree with your government without being its enemy. That idea has required constant defense, not just militarily but culturally, morally, spiritually. And when someone like Toby Keith stands up and says he's not going to let that idea die quietly, that he's going to sing about it and fight for it and refuse to be shamed into silence, he's doing the same work as the soldiers he honors. Different battlefield, same war. Years later, when Toby Keith passed away, the tributes poured in from unexpected places. Veterans who'd never met him shared stories about how his music got them through deployments. Families talked about playing American Soldier at funerals and feeling like their loved ones were being seen, being remembered. Young people who'd grown up hearing his songs without really understanding them went back and listened again, heard the nuance they'd missed, recognized the grief underneath the defiance. And that host, the one who'd tried to humiliate him, never mentioned it publicly, never acknowledged what had happened, because acknowledging it would mean admitting he'd been wrong, not just about Toby Keith, but about the millions of Americans who think like him, who love their country not in spite of its flaws but through them, who understand that freedom requires guardians, and that guardians sometimes die, and that remembering their deaths isn't warmongering, it's the absolute least we owe them. That night in the studio, under those nuclear lights, Toby Keith didn't just defend himself. He defended an entire worldview, a way of seeing America that refuses to apologize for believing in something bigger than individual comfort. He did it with one sentence that cut through all the noise, all the academic posturing, all the smug superiority. Freedom means you get to call me a warmonger, and I don't get to throw you in jail for it. Everything else was just explanation. That one line was the whole argument. That one line was why he won.